"You're too ugly for family photos," my daughter said, her voice sharp as a knife, cutting through a silence I hadn't dared to break until then. The words weren't shouted, nor were they whispered conspiratorially. They landed between us like a cold, deliberate judgment, a sentence passed not in anger, but with a quiet, ruthless certainty that left no room for argument or reply. She looked at me, eyes narrowed just enough to let me know she truly meant it, that this wasn't a momentary lapse or a careless joke born of frustration, but a declaration that I was no longer welcome to share the light, the smiles, the captured moments that would be posted, liked, and curated as part of some perfect family story. That moment, standing in the middle of my grandson's birthday party, surrounded by smiling faces and balloons, was when I first understood the full weight of invisibility. The way it feels not like absence, but like an erasure, a careful cropping out of someone's existence from the narrative they once helped build. I am 78 now, living alone in a modest rented room above a secondhand bookstore, a place that smells of old paper and whispered stories, where I keep a shoebox of photographs under my bed. Most of those pictures are ones where faces are turned away, blurred, or cut off. Not because the images are damaged, but because over the years, I have learned to protect what little remains of my dignity by hiding from the camera, and by hiding my face from the world that refuses to see it. The shoebox is a shrine to the past, to the moments I was once a part of, before my own daughter decided that I was no longer the grandmother her children should be seen with. The birthday party had been planned months in advance, invitations sent to everyone in the family with instructions to dress casually, bring gifts, and prepare for a day full of laughter and memories. Clara, my daughter, had insisted on hiring a professional photographer to capture the event, someone who could deliver those flawless images where every smile looks genuine, every child looks angelic, and every adult looks their absolute best. It was then that I realized the photos were not for me, not for the family, but for the world outside, for the followers on social media, for the people who would judge us by these carefully manufactured glimpses into our lives. I had arrived early that morning, clutching a small wrapped gift for my grandson and wearing the cardigan I knitted myself last winter, the one with tiny purple flowers embroidered on the cuffs, a garment I had thought was cheerful and warm, but, apparently in Clara's eyes, too old, too plain, too imperfect to appear in a picture that would be shared and admired. As I crossed the threshold into the crowded living room, I was met with a polite but guarded silence, as if I were a visitor in someone else's home rather than the woman who had raised Clara, who had changed diapers and wiped tears, who had stayed up through sleepless nights and long days, who had baked countless cakes for birthdays and holidays, all of which now seemed forgotten. The photographer's camera clicked and flashed around me, but I noticed she never trained her lens on my face. Instead, she focused on the children, on Clara and her husband, on the guests who mingled effortlessly, their smiles broad and genuine, or so it seemed from a distance. My own smile felt forced, a mask I wore so that no one would see the ache blooming quietly in my chest. The moment came when Clara leaned toward me, her voice low and almost conspiratorial, and said, "Mom, maybe it's best if you stay behind today. You know, out of the photos. It'll just be easier for everyone." I nodded, swallowing the lump that formed in my throat. I wanted to protest, to tell her that my face belonged here just as much as anyone else's, that the wrinkles and gray hairs were badges of a lifetime of love and struggle, but I stayed silent, Instead, I retreated to the kitchen, where I washed dishes and wiped counters, a ghost in the midst of a celebration. I could hear laughter from the living room, the hum of happy conversations, but they were distant, as if separated by glass or walls thicker than wood. The hours passed slowly, and I found myself watching the family photo slideshow on the screen, the images flickering with perfect smiles and bright eyes, none of which included me. At one point, I found an old, worn album tucked away on a high shelf and opened it carefully. The photographs inside told a different story, a story where I was there, sitting beside my daughter, holding my grandson's tiny hand, smiling in the sun-dappled garden. But those moments had been erased, edited out of the digital archives, deleted from the social feeds. It was a quiet, cutting form of rejection, a message delivered not in words but in absence, and it struck me with the force of a blow I hadn't expected to endure. That night, lying alone in my small room, the shoebox of photographs felt heavier than ever. Each picture was a fragment of a life that no longer belonged to me, a life where my daughter's love had been replaced by disdain and dismissal. I thought about the countless birthdays I had celebrated, the meals I had prepared, the stories I had told, and I wondered when I had become invisible. The pain was sharp but silent, a steady ache beneath the surface that threatened to break through at the slightest provocation. I traced my fingers over the edges of the photos, feeling the smoothness of the paper, the faded colors of memories that refused to fade entirely. I realized then that the album was more than a collection of images. It was a testament to my existence, a record of a woman who had loved fiercely and given endlessly, but had been deemed too ugly, too inconvenient, too irrelevant to appear in the pictures that mattered. The next morning, I sat by the window watching the world outside move on without me. The sun cast long shadows across the street. The leaves whispered in the breeze, and somewhere far away, children laughed and played, unaware of the quiet battle being waged in a small rented room above a bookstore. I did not cry, nor did I scream. Instead, I gathered the courage to face the truth. I was no longer a part of the family I had helped build, no longer welcome in the frame of their carefully constructed life. But in that moment of deep, aching loss, something else stirred within me. A resolve, a flicker of defiance that would not be extinguished. I would find a way to be seen, to reclaim the parts of myself that had been erased, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant rebuilding from the fragments left behind. And so, with the weight of rejection heavy on my shoulders, but the spark of resilience flickering in my heart, I took the first step toward a new chapter, a chapter where I would be visible again, not as a faded shadow in someone else's photograph, but as a woman who refused to be unseen. The moment I realized that this was not a misunderstanding, not a fleeting moment of thoughtlessness, but a deliberate act of exclusion, came in the form of a phone call from Clara the very next morning after the birthday party, her voice tight and rehearsed as if she were reading from a script written by someone else, someone who had convinced her that what she was doing was necessary, even kind. She told me, without apology or warmth, that the family had decided to remove all photos that included me from their online albums and social media accounts, explaining it as a measure to maintain a consistent family image and to protect the children from confusion. I listened to the words, a hollow echo in the room where I sat alone, clutching the telephone as though it could somehow bridge the widening chasm between us. She spoke of how the children didn't understand why Grandma looked different, how they had begun to ask questions that Clara found difficult to answer, how the photos that featured me disrupted the harmony of the curated family narrative. In her voice was a careful detachment, a practiced tone of rationality that made the cruelty feel almost clinical, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis no one wanted to hear. I did not interrupt, though every fiber of my being screamed to shout back, to demand why my face, my presence, my years of love and care had been reduced to an aesthetic problem, something to be hidden away like an inconvenient truth. Instead, I stayed silent, nodding quietly as if that would somehow make the pain less real, as if my quiet acceptance might soothe the wound she had inflicted so effortlessly. The days that followed were marked by a growing distance that felt like drowning in slow motion. Clara stopped calling me regularly. Her messages became brief and impersonal, and invitations to family events dwindled to nothing. When I tried to reach out, I was met with curt responses, or, more often, no response at all. It was as though I had become a ghost in a house I once filled with life and laughter, someone whose presence was tolerated only insofar as it did not disrupt the polished facade Clara had built so carefully around herself and her family. One afternoon, I received a package in the mail, a thin envelope containing the family photo album from the birthday party. I opened it with trembling hands, hoping to find some trace of inclusion, some small acknowledgement that I still belonged. Instead, I found that my face had been blurred out in every single photograph where I appeared. It was a silent excision, a digital erasure that cut me out of the story as though I had never been part of it. The images were pristine and perfect without me, the smiles bright and the colors vivid. But the empty spaces where my face had been were a stark reminder of how thoroughly I had been erased. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I ran my fingers over the pages, tracing the blurred patches as if trying to bring back the woman they had wiped away. It was a profound betrayal, not just of a mother or grandmother, but of a human being who had loved and sacrificed, who had given so much and received so little in return. The realization that I had become, in the eyes of my own daughter and grandchildren, an unwelcome and ugly secret, was a blow that shattered my sense of self in ways I had not anticipated. I retreated into solitude, my days marked by a growing silence that was both imposed and embraced. I stopped trying to reach out, stopped waiting for calls that never came, and instead began to focus on the small acts of care I could still perform for myself. The shoebox of old photographs, the small rituals of making tea just the way I liked it, the evenings spent reading by the flickering light of a worn lamp, became my refuge in a world that had turned its back on me. Yet beneath the quiet surface, a storm was building, a fierce determination not to disappear quietly into the shadows. I began to take photographs of myself, not for anyone else, but as a declaration of presence, a way of saying that I still existed and still mattered, even if my own family could no longer see me. With a disposable camera I bought from the corner store, I captured simple moments, my hands holding a cup of steaming tea, the worn stitches on cardigan I still wore despite their disapproval, the reflection of my face in the cracked mirror of my rented room. Each image was a small act of rebellion, a refusal to be erased or ignored. When I sent one of these photos to Clara, unsigned and without explanation, I watched with a mix of hope and fear as the message was received, but not replied to. The silence that followed was deafening, a void where connection once lived. The emotional violence I endured was subtle, but profound, an erasure not marked by shouting or overt cruelty, but by absence, by the refusal to acknowledge, by the systematic rewriting of a family narrative that no longer included me. This exclusion was not just about photographs or appearances. It was about the fundamental human need to be seen, to be recognized, to be loved and remembered. The pain of being deemed too ugly to appear in family photos was inseparable from the deeper wound of being deemed too invisible to exist. As the weeks passed, I found strength in the quiet moments of resistance, the photographs I took of myself, the letters I wrote but never sent, the memories I held close as a shield against the coldness that surrounded me. The catalyst for my journey was not a single act of cruelty, but the cumulative weight of neglect, dismissal, and rejection that made it clear I would have to fight for my place in the world on my own terms. This realization was both devastating and liberating. It marked the beginning of a transformation, a turning point where I chose not to remain a passive victim of erasure, but to reclaim my identity, my dignity, and my right to be seen. In the depths of betrayal, I found the first flicker of resilience, the seed of a new story that I would write for myself. The journey ahead would be long and lonely at times, marked by challenges and heartbreak, but it was mine to walk, and I would walk it with the quiet, unyielding strength of a woman who refused to be invisible. After the cruel silence that followed the photo erasure and the cold dismissal from my daughter, I began to notice how the subtle erosion of my place in their lives crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet with a persistent, grinding relentlessness that wore away at the very foundation of my identity and belonging. It was not marked by loud arguments or dramatic confrontations, but by a slow, steady shrinking of my role within the family, as if I were fading like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The gatherings I once looked forward to became exercises in invisibility, where I was present but unseen, heard but not listened to. At holiday dinners, I found myself relegated to the kitchen or the far end of the dining table, where conversations flowed around me like a river bypassing a rock, never touching the solid presence I tried to maintain. The children, once eager to sit on my lap and listen to my stories, now glanced past me with distracted eyes, speaking instead to their parents or the glowing screens in their hands. I overheard my daughter Clara telling friends that I was a bit much, or not the easiest person to manage, phrases that stung sharply because they disguised a deeper disdain under the guise of polite social critique. She would call me occasionally, but those calls were brief and clipped, filled with updates about the grandchildren and the household, but carefully avoiding any real conversation or emotional connection. It was as if our relationship had been transformed into a transaction, a scheduled appointment, rather than the lifelong bond of mother and daughter it once was. At home, I noticed how the small tokens of affection that had once filled my days vanished like mist. The photographs that adorned the walls no longer included me. Even the old framed picture on my nightstand, a gift from my late husband, was moved to a forgotten shelf in a dark corner. Invitations to family events arrived less frequently, often with an unspoken expectation that I would decline or not make the effort to attend. When I did show up, I was met with polite but distant smiles, as if my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The subtle acts of control grew more suffocating over time. I was asked to help out at gatherings, but never invited to sit with the family. I was expected to prepare food or tidy the house, but was discouraged from sharing my own stories or opinions. When I tried to assert myself, I was gently but firmly talked over, dismissed as old-fashioned or too sensitive. It was a slow erasure that wore down my confidence, leaving me questioning my own worth and place in a family that seemed increasingly eager to distance itself from me. Even in my own home, I felt the walls closing in. Clara insisted on redecorating the living room to match her modern tastes, replacing the quilts I had sewn and the photographs I had carefully arranged with sleek furniture and abstract art that felt cold and impersonal. The kitchen was stripped of its warmth, the cupboards emptied of familiar dishes and replaced with new sets that I was not invited to use or unpack. It was as if my memories, my history, and my presence were being packed away alongside the boxes of old belongings that Clara said were cluttering up the space. The grandchildren, too, seemed to slip further away. They no longer called me Grandma with the same affection. Instead, they used distant terms like Mom's mom, as if I were a figure from a story rather than a living, breathing woman who had cared for them since their first breaths. When I tried to connect, they were polite but uninterested, their attention drawn to their devices or their parents' instructions. The gentle touches and hugs I once cherished were replaced by quick nods or awkward pats on the shoulder. I felt like a ghost haunting a house that had once been my home, a presence tolerated only because of obligation rather than love. The first escalation of my exclusion was marked by these quiet violences, the kind that slip beneath the radar of most people's awareness, but cut deeply into the soul. It was in the way Clara would sigh loudly when I entered the room, the way conversations would halt briefly before resuming in hushed tones, the way family photos were arranged with me deliberately cropped out or blurred beyond recognition. It was in the small, cruel comments made in passing about my appearance, my habits, my old-fashioned ways. These moments were like tiny cuts, each one almost too small to notice, but over time, they bled together into a wound that refused to heal. One particular afternoon stands out in my memory as the moment when the full weight of this slow erasure became undeniable. I had come to visit Clara's house unannounced, carrying a batch of cookies I had baked with love, hoping to surprise my grandchildren and perhaps reclaim a small piece of the family I once knew. As I entered, I was greeted not with hugs or warm smiles, but with a cool glance from Clara and a whispered instruction from her husband to make yourself useful in the kitchen. I was shown where to hang my coat, away from the main living area, and told the children were busy and couldn't be disturbed. I spent the afternoon quietly washing dishes and tidying up, hearing laughter and chatter drift from the other room, but never once invited to join. When the children did pass by, their eyes looked through me, their voices busy with the latest games or school gossip, and I was left standing alone in the hallway, clutching a dish towel that suddenly felt heavy in my hands. Later, Clara approached me, her voice soft but firm, telling me that things had changed, and that it might be better if I limited my visits, that the children were sensitive, and that my presence sometimes made them uncomfortable. I wanted to cry or scream or plead, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded and promised to respect their wishes, even as my heart broke a little more. This was the moment when I understood that my exclusion was no accident, no temporary misunderstanding, but a deliberate and permanent shift in our family dynamics. I was no longer a beloved grandmother, but a tolerated outsider, someone whose presence had become inconvenient and whose love was no longer enough to secure a place at the table. In the weeks that followed, I found myself shrinking further, withdrawing into the quiet corners of my own life where I could find some semblance of peace. I took long walks in the neighborhood, stopping at the park to watch children play, remembering the days when my own family gathered there with laughter and joy. I visited the bookstore downstairs more often, losing myself in the pages of novels that spoke of resilience and hope. Yet even as I sought solace in solitude, the ache of exclusion gnawed at me, a persistent reminder of the love that had been withheld, the connection that had been severed. The first escalation was not a single event, but a series of small, accumulating losses. A chair left empty, a conversation ignored, a smile withheld, that together formed a slow and painful unmaking of a woman who had once been the center of her family's universe. But within this erosion, beneath the layers of grief and loneliness, a quiet ember of determination began to glow. I realized that while I could not control the actions or feelings of others, I could choose how to respond. I could either disappear into the shadows or find a way to reclaim my visibility, my voice, and my dignity. It was a choice that would shape the next chapters of my life, a choice born from the very pain that sought to silence me. This was the beginning of my journey, not just away from the family who had cast me aside, but toward a new understanding of myself as a woman worthy of love and recognition on her own terms, not as an accessory to someone else's carefully curated life. The path ahead was uncertain and at times frightening, but it was mine to walk, and I would walk it with the quiet courage of someone who has learned that invisibility is not a fate, but a challenge to be met with resilience. The moment that marked the turning point in my story, the subtle but powerful shift from passive acceptance to quiet defiance, came not with a grand gesture or a dramatic confrontation, but in the stillness of a late afternoon when I found myself alone. In Clara's living room, drawn to a photo album resting on the coffee table, its cover worn and familiar, yet heavy with the weight of things unsaid. I opened it carefully, as though the pages might tear under the fragile weight of memories I both longed for and feared to face. Inside, the photographs told two conflicting stories. The ones I remembered, where I was present and smiling, where my hands held my grandsons, where my eyes caught the light of joy and belonging, and the newer versions, the ones Clara had curated, where my face was blurred or cropped out altogether, where my presence was edited away as if I had never existed. The album was more than a collection of images. It was a ledger of erasure, a visual record of the slow unraveling of my place in the family. As I traced the faded edges of the pictures with trembling fingers, I felt a fierce sadness rising, but alongside it, a stubborn spark of clarity and resolve. I realized then that if I continued to wait quietly for them to see me, to remember me, I would remain invisible forever. I could not rely on their recognition or approval to reclaim my identity. Instead, I had to act, to take control of my own story and find a way to be seen on my own terms. Later that evening, with the album tucked under my arm, I walked slowly through the streets of my neighborhood, the cool air brushing against my skin like a whispered promise of change. I stopped at a small corner store and purchased a disposable camera, something simple and unassuming, a tool that would help me capture the world as I saw it, unfiltered and unapologetic. The next few days were filled with quiet experimentation. I learned to hold the camera steadily, framing shots that felt honest and real. The worn hands of a neighbor pulling weeds in her garden, the soft light filtering through the curtains of my rented room, the faded pages of a well-loved book resting on the table. And then, finally, I began to turn the lens on myself, taking pictures that revealed a woman who was more than a cropped-out figure in an album. I captured the lines on my face, each one a story etched by time and experience. The silver strands of my hair catching the sunlight, the steady gaze of eyes that had seen loss but refused to be defeated. These images were small acts of rebellion, affirmations of existence that defied the erasure I had endured. One by one, I mailed the developed photos to Clara, slipping them into envelopes without a word, no explanations, no demands, just the silent testimony of a woman reclaiming her visibility. The responses were muted, as I had expected. No phone calls, no letters, no acknowledgement. But I did not need their approval or recognition anymore. The act itself was enough. It was a way to say, I am here. I am still here. This shift was not without its fears and doubts. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if I had overstepped, if my small rebellion would only deepen the chasm between us. But the quiet strength I found in these moments outweighed the loneliness. I began to understand that the power to define myself could not be taken away by others, no matter how deeply they wished to erase me. The photographs became a mirror in which I saw not just my own reflection, but a woman who had survived betrayal and rejection, who had found the courage to step out of the shadows and into the light, even if that light was still dim and flickering. In this process, I also discovered new ways to connect, with strangers in the bookstore who shared their own stories of loss and resilience, with neighbors who greeted me warmly on my walks, with the quiet hum of the city that pulsed with life beyond, the walls of family and expectation. The midpoint of my journey was not a moment of reconciliation or forgiveness, but a declaration of independence, a reclaiming of self that set the course for all that would follow. It was the day I stopped waiting to be seen and started to see myself. And in that seeing, I found a beginning where there had only been endings. The quiet power of that realization carried me forward, steady and sure, toward a future that was mine to shape, not as a shadow cast by others, but as a woman who had learned that the truest visibility comes from within. The second escalation came like a storm rolling in on a clear day, sudden and relentless, challenging the fragile peace I had begun to build with the quiet photographs and my tentative steps toward reclaiming my identity. Just as I started to feel the tentative warmth of new beginnings, the past reached out with a force I had not anticipated, reminding me that the ties to my family, though frayed and strained, still bound me in ways I had yet to fully understand or escape. It began with a letter from my grandson, Kieran. His handwriting was large and awkward, the way a boy's often is when he tries to put feelings into words but isn't quite sure how. The letter was short but heartfelt, filled with a longing that pierced through the cold walls Clara and Adam had built around me. He wrote about missing me, about wondering if I was safe, about hoping I would answer his calls and come back to the family. I read his words over and over, feeling the bittersweet mixture of love and sorrow, hope and fear. Here was a connection untouched by the bitterness that had soured the rest of the family, a thread of warmth amid the chill of rejection. Yet even as I clung to that thread, I knew that responding would mean stepping back into a world that had so thoroughly excluded me. The next weeks brought more pressure from Clara and Adam, who did not hesitate to remind me that my disappearance was a source of distress, a disruption to the carefully constructed family image they sought to maintain. Clara showed up unexpectedly at the cafe where I had begun working part-time, her presence like a cold gust of wind that unsettled the quiet space I had carved out for myself. Her eyes were sharp, her words measured but laced with a familiar edge of control. "We thought you were unstable," she said, as if that explained everything, as if dismissing me as fragile would justify the years of neglect and exclusion. She demanded the return of the photo album I had taken from her house, insisting that I had no right to hold on to images that were part of her family's private life. I refused, not out of defiance alone, but because those photographs were now symbols of my resistance, fragments of a history I refused to let be rewritten without me. The confrontation was tense but brief, and Clara left with a promise that if I did not comply, the matter would escalate beyond words. Legal threats and ultimatums hovered unspoken between us, a reminder that the battle for my visibility was also a fight for my autonomy. Alongside Clara's visit came a barrage of messages, emails, texts, even a formal letter from a lawyer representing the family's interests, each one echoing the same demands wrapped in concern. They accused me of causing unnecessary drama, of putting the family through stress during what should have been joyous occasions, of acting irrationally by choosing distance over dialogue. Their words stung, not just because of their content, but because of the way they sought to rewrite the narrative, to paint me as the problem, rather than the woman who had been pushed aside. But I was no longer willing to accept their version of the story. I had begun to understand that my absence was a form of protection, a boundary drawn to preserve what was left of my dignity and peace. In the midst of this pressure, Kieran's voice was a balm. He called when I least expected it, his tone hesitant but genuine, a bridge spanning the gap that so many others refused to cross. Our conversations were cautious at first, filled with pauses and half-spoken thoughts, but slowly they grew warmer, richer, with the simple connection of two people who still cared despite the distance. He told me about his struggles, his hopes, the small victories and disappointments of growing up. I shared with him stories of the city I now called home, the cafe where I worked, the neighbors who had become friends, and the quiet life I was building from the fragments of what had been broken. This relationship became a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there could be light and love. But the family's attempts to reclaim me did not end with words or visits. There was a community gossip swirling around my disappearance, a mix of concern and speculation that found its way into the local newspaper. An article appeared, framed as a family speaks out piece, portraying me as vulnerable, lost, and in need of care. The quotes from Clara and Adam painted a picture of a woman who had vanished without warning, causing worry and confusion. Someone who was not the type to leave her family voluntarily. I read the article with a mixture of disbelief and bitter amusement. Their concern felt performative, a spectacle designed more to reassure the outside world than to reach me. I laughed aloud, a sharp, startled sound that surprised even me. The article was proof not of my fragility, but of their fear of losing control, of their inability to see me as an autonomous woman with her own will and voice. In response, I continued to build my new life quietly but resolutely. At the cafe, Heather, the manager who had taken me on without questions or pity, gave me extra shifts, a small gesture that spoke volumes about trust and respect. Arthur, a regular customer and widower, became a steady presence, a companion in the background who understood the language of unspoken grief and quiet strength. Together, they helped anchor me in this new world, one that was less polished than the family I had left, but far richer in authenticity and kindness. Clara's unexpected visit to the cafe one gray Thursday afternoon was another test. She stood stiffly by the pastry display, her expression unreadable, as if she were trying to measure the distance between us with her eyes. I did not approach her. Instead, I kept busy behind the counter, letting her sweat in the awkward silence. When she finally spoke, asking to talk privately, I nodded and led her to a booth at the back. The conversation was strained and full of half-truths and excuses. She admitted to panicking that day at the airport lounge when I was left behind, but her words rang hollow against the backdrop of years of neglect. She said she never meant to replace me, that she just did not want my shadow looming over every family moment. I told her I was not a shadow, but a woman who had finally remembered how to be herself again. She left without finishing her coffee, the silence between us louder than any words. The second escalation was not just about confrontation or demands. It was about the struggle for recognition, for respect, for the right to exist on one's own terms. It was the collision between a family's need for control and a woman's refusal to be erased. The pressure was intense, but beneath it grew a steadier, stronger resolve. I was no longer the scared woman waiting to be seen. I was becoming someone who demanded to be recognized, who understood that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not with anger or tears, but with quiet persistence and unwavering self-respect. This escalation tested me in ways I had not expected. There were moments of doubt and loneliness, times when the weight of rejection felt too heavy to bear. But each challenge also brought clarity and strength. I learned that love can be conditional, and that sometimes the hardest thing is to love oneself when others refuse to do so. The battles with Clara and Adam made me confront painful truths, but they also pushed me to seek new connections, to build a life beyond the family that had cast me aside. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself standing taller, speaking more firmly, and living more freely. I wrote letters, not to the family, but to Kieran and to myself, letters that spoke of hope, healing, and the reclaiming of dignity. I refused to be silenced or diminished. In the quiet moments after the storm, I realized that the second escalation had not broken me, but had forged me anew. The woman who emerged was not just a grandmother or a mother, but a survivor and a creator of a new narrative. I had learned that while the past may haunt, it does not have to define us, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage are the ones that reclaim our right to be seen and heard in a world that often tries to make us invisible. The day I finally decided to draw the line, to carve out a boundary that no one could cross, was not marked by loud confrontation or dramatic spectacle, but by the quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming my power in a way that was as much about dignity as it was about defiance. After months of being pushed, pulled, and pressured by Clara and Adam, after their relentless attempts to control my narrative and dictate the terms of my existence, I found within myself a strength that surprised even me, a strength born from exhaustion, clarity, and the slow, burning desire to be seen not as an object of pity or a source of family drama, but as a woman who demanded respect and autonomy. It began with a letter I wrote to the family's lawyer, a carefully measured note that left no room for manipulation or misinterpretation. In it, I stated that I was of sound mind and living in a safe environment of my own choosing. I declared that I had retained legal counsel and that any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. The letter was short, cold in its formality, but fierce in its intent. I signed it with a steady hand and mailed it the following morning, feeling a mixture of relief and finality that came with closing a chapter that had long been fraught with pain. That act of sending the letter was my personal reckoning, the moment I took control of the story that had been so violently rewritten around me. It was not vengeance or anger that fueled me, but a profound need to establish boundaries where none had been respected before. I was no longer willing to endure the subtle violences of exclusion and erasure, the manipulations disguised as concern, the veiled threats wrapped in love. Alongside the letter to the lawyer, I wrote a short note to Clara. It was only a few lines, but each word carried the weight of years of unspoken hurt and quiet rebellion. I told her that I knew what she had done and what she had left unsaid. I assured her I was not angry, only done, that I was not coming back, and that she should take care of her own life now. That note was not an invitation to dialogue or reconciliation, but a declaration of independence and closure. The power in those written words gave me a sense of liberation, unlike anything I had felt in years. In the days that followed, I continued to build my life away from the shadows of the family I had lost. I embraced the small joys and steady rhythms of my new existence, working at the cafe, sharing quiet conversations with Heather and Arthur, tending to the few possessions that reminded me of who I was beyond the roles imposed on me. The new photo album I created was the tangible symbol of this reclamation. I gathered all the discarded, blurred, and deleted photos of myself, the ones Clara had tried to erase, and pasted them into its pages, one by one, each image a testament to my resilience and refusal to vanish. On the last page, I placed a torn photograph of Clara and me, marking it boldly with red ink the words, "You inherited my face." Try erasing that. This album was more than a collection of images. It was a manifesto, a challenge, a statement that I would no longer be edited out of my own story. The day Clara showed up at the cafe was another turning point, though this time I met her not with anger or apology, but with the calm assurance of someone who had finally found peace within herself. She stood awkwardly by the pastry display, her polished exterior unable to mask the unease beneath. I did not rush to her side or seek to mend what had been broken. Instead, I let her sweat in the silence as I went about my work. When she asked to speak privately, I nodded and led her to the quiet booth at the back, the same booth where I had once been invisible, but where now I held my ground with quiet strength. Our conversation was honest in its own way. She admitted to panicking the day I was left behind in the airport lounge, her voice softened by the weight of regret, or perhaps just the exhaustion of the charade. She claimed she had never meant to replace me, only to protect the family from what she saw as disruption. I told her I was not a shadow to be cast aside, but a woman who had remembered how to stand in her own light. She left without finishing her coffee, and I returned to my work, feeling neither victory nor defeat, only the steady certainty of having taken back my power. That night, as I sat alone in my small room, the quiet hum of the city outside my window felt like a pulse syncing with my own heartbeat. The battles and betrayals of the past months had not been erased, but they no longer defined me. I was a woman transformed, one who had learned that dignity is not given, but claimed, that love is not always enough, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to say no, to refuse to be diminished, silenced, or erased. The climax of my journey was not a loud breaking point, but a deep, still moment of resolution, where I finally closed the door on a chapter of pain and opened another filled with possibility and self-respect. I realized that the power to shape my story had always been within me, waiting to be claimed, and that the woman I was becoming was not just surviving, but thriving, not just seen, but unmissable. The journey was far from over, but this moment marked the pivot, the fulcrum on which my life turned from one of invisibility and rejection to one of presence and affirmation. In this reclaiming of my narrative, I found not just closure but a beginning, the start of a life that belonged to me and me alone, a life where I could be whole, seen, and unapologetically myself. In the quiet that followed the storm of confrontation and final letters, I found a stillness that was neither loneliness nor emptiness, but something more profound, a peace that comes from knowing you have reclaimed yourself after years of being unseen. The days settled into a rhythm that felt natural, steady, and wholly my own. I continued my work at the cafe, the comforting hum of morning conversations and the clatter of cups providing a soundtrack to a life that no longer depended on the fragile approval of a family that had cast me aside. It was in these small moments, the pouring of coffee, the greeting of familiar faces, the soft exchanges with Heather and Arthur, that I began to feel the fullness of my presence. I was no longer waiting for a seat at someone else's table. I was making my own, carving out space with hands that had once only prepared meals for others, but now built a life for myself. The shoebox of old photographs remained under my bed, but it no longer held the weight of longing or regret. Instead, it was a testament to the life I had lived, the love I had given, and the strength I had found to let go of what no longer served me. One afternoon, I placed the old album, the one filled with the blurred and erased images, into the hands of the bookstore owner downstairs with a simple note. These women lived. If you need proof you existed, take one. It was a quiet act of sharing, a gift to others who might feel invisible, unseen, or forgotten, a reminder that every life matters and deserves to be remembered. The bookstore became a place of connection, a sanctuary where I met women who, like me, carried stories of betrayal, rejection, and resilience. Together, we began a project I called the Unseen Archive, a collection of portraits and stories that celebrated the lives of elderly women in the neighborhood, those often overlooked or pushed to the margins. I photographed them with the same care I had learned to give myself, printing their images and displaying them on the bookstore's back wall. Each portrait was a declaration. We exist. We matter. We are here. It was a healing work, not just for them, but for me, a way to transform my own pain into something meaningful and expansive. My relationship with Kieran deepened in this new phase, a connection that brought me joy and hope. He came to visit on his own terms, bringing books and stories, offering a gentle presence that was not burdened by expectation or obligation. We spoke honestly about the past, but we looked forward with cautious optimism. I saw in him the possibility of reconciliation, not with the family that had rejected me, but with the part of my heart that still yearned for connection. The silence from Clara and Adam continued, but it no longer held power over me. I understood now that their inability to see me was a reflection of their own limitations, not a measure of my worth. The letter I had written to myself, taped inside my dresser drawer, was a constant reminder. You waited so long for someone to save you, but you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. These words carried me through the quiet days and the moments of doubt, grounding me in the knowledge that my life was mine to live on my own terms, with or without their recognition. There were days when the ache of absence still flared, when memories and regrets threatened to pull me back into the shadows. But I met those moments with compassion for myself and the fierce determination to keep moving forward. I learned to celebrate the small victories, the smiles shared with strangers, the warmth of a new friendship, the simple pleasure of a well-made cup of tea in the late afternoon light. The new life I had built was not without its challenges, but it was whole and real. It was mine, and that was enough. As the seasons changed, I found myself embracing the quiet beauty of this chapter. I baked lemon squares for the community potluck, sharing them with neighbors who greeted me with genuine smiles and stories of their own lives. I walked the streets with a new coat I had bought for myself, a symbol of my renewed sense of self-worth and dignity. The coat fit like a promise, warm and strong, just like the woman who wore it. One evening, as Joyce and I sat wrapped in blankets on the porch, watching the moon rise over the quiet neighborhood, she turned to me and said, "You've been here almost 2 months now. Planning to stay?" I looked out at the soft glow of the streetlights and nodded. "Yes," I said. "This house is weird without someone yelling at the cat." We laughed softly, the sound a balm to my heart. The journey that had begun with rejection and betrayal had brought me to this place of quiet strength and acceptance. I was no longer the woman hidden behind blurred photos and silent dinners. I was seen, not just by others, but by myself. My story was no longer one of loss alone, but of survival, resilience, and the fierce beauty of reclaiming one's own life. To any woman who finds herself invisible, dismissed, or erased, I say this: you are not alone. Your story matters. And the day you choose to be your own sign, your own noise in the silence, that day is the beginning of everything. I will be here, waiting to hear your voice.